So for our final speaker this morning, I'm pleased to welcome Anna Ficek, who is a recent graduate of the Master of Art History program in Hunter College, and will begin her doctoral work this fall at the CUNY Grad Center. It's CUNY, University of the City of New York, of course. Sorry. She's also worked in curatorial department at the Guggenheim, the Brooklyn Museum, and El Museo del Barrio. And her current research deals with the art of the colonial Andes, but she has done work on intercultural exchange in the 18th century, and it's from that work that her paper today derives, which will be on Polish collections of Meissen porcelain. So please welcome Anna Ficek.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. So I'm just going to start this off. Since Europeans first encountered porcelain during the early trade with the East, the opulent white material was seen as both a symbol of luxury and aristocratic excess, as well as the heart of a politically fraught exchange between East and West. When the first European porcelain production was established by Meissen, in Meissen, Saxony in 1710, Europe finally found a way to compete with Asia, and particularly China, with regard to the production and trade of one of the most precious and ostentatious commodities. This paper centers on the intercultural exchanges of porcelain that stemmed from this early manufacture in Europe, and how porcelain was an integral tool to consolidating power in the Polish-Lithuanian court under the reign of both Augustus II and his son Augustus III. In the next 20 minutes, I will explore how the more nuanced issues of exoticism, political power, trickery, and material exchange manifested in the production of porcelain figurines in Meissen for a specific market in Warsaw. My research in this field encompasses the varied layers of exoticism between Poland, the East, and Western Europe, and the manifestation of a political and cultural ideology called Sarmatism. Also, as you can see in the title, I use the term the long 18th century. It's a concept usually applied to British history, but in this case, I think the term applies, as I'm looking at a period that encompasses the founding of the Meissen factory in 1710, continuing through the three partitions of Poland in 1772, 1793, and 1795, and onward into the beginning of the 19th century. This broader chronological examination allows the scope of this research to follow these porcelain objects from the aristocratic houses of Warsaw to the chateaux of Paris, where Polish emigres who dreamed of independence eventually settled in the 19th century, following a series of insurrections against the occupying nations. By following the figurines across the continent, their inherent meaning changes, from symbols of luxury, aristocracy, and the status quo to embodiments of national identity when the nation no longer existed. So I want to start this discussion with this. It's a porcelain sculpture of Augustus III, King of Poland and Elector of Saxony. The 18th century piece, it's part of the collection of the Milwaukee Museum of Art and stands at about 2.5 feet high. The sculpture was produced in the Meissen factory, which was founded by Augustus II, his father, just outside of Dresden. And as I mentioned previously, it was the first porcelain factory in Europe, allowing the Wettin monarchs to produce their own porcelain, which they did a lot, instead of importing this white gold from the East, which was not just costly, but also put European economies in an unfavorable position against major Asian exporters. Beyond the significance of its materiality is the iconography. Augustus is not dressed in typical German aristocratic costume. Instead, he wears the very distinguishable garb of the Polish aristocracy, the Sarmatians. Augustus wears a chupan robe under his contuche coat with the long, loose sleeves that are untied and thrown across his shoulder, a sign that he is ready for battle. The robe and coat are loosely tied at the waist with a red and gold sash. His slouching leather boots, long szabla saber, and a red fur-trimmed konfederatka cap are all signifiers of Sarmatism. The The porcelain Augustus takes the same stance, dress, and composition as the 1737 portrait by Louis de Sylvestre, except that the deep reds and rich furs contrast with the translucent materiality of porcelain. In both the painted and porcelain portraits, Augustus III identifies himself not with Germany, but with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an important political tactic that allowed the German monarch to profess his Polishness from Dresden, aligning himself with the Sarmatians of the Warsaw court. Sarmatism was a political and cultural phenomenon throughout the Polish aristocratic classes, starting in the 15th century, with the publication of the History of Poland, or Historia Polonica, by Jan Długosz. In this text, Długosz claimed that the Polish aristocratic and noble classes were direct descendants of Sarmatian tribes, a primarily Iranian people who originated north of the Black Sea and inhabited Slavic lands before the 6th century BCE. This unsubstantiated claim of a distant Eastern ancestry manifested itself in the aristocratic classes, with the appropriation of Iranian or Oriental-inspired dress and visual culture. Throughout the centuries, Sarmatism developed into a complex identity, not only in fashion, but also in the visual arts, music, literature, and political theory. In politics, Sarmatism gave birth to the idea of the liberum veto, a system of elected monarchy which differentiated the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the hereditary systems of government in neighboring Western monarchies and kingdoms, the Ottoman Empire, and Slavic Russia. The process of electing a monarch engaged the entire titled class. Each nobleman had one vote and one veto to elect a new king. Domestically, Sarmatism also legitimized the rule of the noble and aristocratic classes by one of its founding tenets, that those descended from the Sarmatian tribes were inherently superior to the Slavic culture of the common Polak, justifying the near-feudal state of the Polish class system into the era of partition. While politically complex, Sarmatism also allowed for greater political engagement by female nobles. One example is Elżbieta Sieniawska, the Grand Hetmaness of the Crown, also known as the uncrowned Queen of Poland. She was heavily involved in national and international politics, negotiations between foreign leaders and prospective Polish kings, and was a patron for many local and international artists from the late 17th and early 18th century, including Louis de Sylvestre. Sarmatism, like many other cultural manifestations of the 18th century, allowed for greater fluidity between gender roles and opened up doors for women as figures, political figures, collectors, and patrons of the arts. This fluidity of gender can also be seen in the costume, as women are portrayed wearing typically male garments, and the differentiation between costumes for men and women were blurred. This unique collective identity adopted by the aristocracy and nobility of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fueled a game of cultural appropriation and counter-appropriation between Poland, the East, and the West, in which porcelain became an important tool that curried favor as well as images of exoticness and aristocratic identity. The import of Meissen products manufactured to a specifically Polish audience was so extensive during the reign of Augustus II and III that Meissen established a salesroom in Warsaw where porcelain could be purchased directly, the first of its kind outside of Saxony. The Warsaw salesroom functioned from 1731 to 1798, speaking to the prolonged fashion of Meissen porcelain even after the Commonwealth lost its independence. In his studies of collection practices of Meissen porcelain by Polish nobility during the 18th century, Jakub Sito enumerates Augustus III as responsible for the greatest influx of Meissen porcelain into the Commonwealth. Not only a lucrative export for the Meissen factory, porcelain was also used by the king to reward his favorites in the Warsaw court and appeal to the staunch individualism of the nobility and aristocracy. While the consumption of Meissen porcelain was particularly significant in the collecting habits of the Warsaw elite, the iconography of the figurines produced for this market further highlight the intersection of porcelain's ostentation and Sarmatian individuality and political power. Through the blending of typically Sarmatian sartorial elements with contemporary fashions, as you can see in these figures of Polish noblewomen, in this case, the robe à la polonaise, the ankle-length dress, fashionable in the West, The figures appeared to elite collectors and positioned the Sarmatian identity within the greater landscape of European aristocratic excess and frivolity. Figurines such as these of Polish noblewomen allow Sarmatian women to identify themselves at once as fashionable and deeply patriotic, combining typical Sarmatian costume with other European fashionable items. Similar figurines were also produced of noblemen portrayed in dynamic poses which better showed the exotic nature of their costume. The male figures are shown as looking far more Eastern, without the concern for blending the Western fashion with as in the female examples. Their long, loose-fitting robes are tied with a sash, and their open fur-lined sleeves are flung across the shoulder just like Augustus III. The noblemen have shaved heads and large mustaches, also key identifiers of Sarmatian costume in Poland and abroad, strongly suggesting the influence of the East, for example, Iran, China, and the Ottoman Empire, to highlight the imagined connection with these Eastern kingdoms. These clear visual appropriations from the East both demonstrate a unique type of early Orientalism and Turkery, but also attach an element of exoticism to the national identity of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which in turn was then appropriated by the West. This complex relationship between the Sarmatians and the Ottoman Empire was described by Professor Avcioglu as such, quote, Sarmatian kings have already conceded to the greatness of the Ottoman sultans. Yet when self-representation becomes a matter of a conscious act, the intricate and dynamic uses of imagery refuse to offer a unidirectional reading. It is meant to be more than just about emulating the Ottoman sultan. This multiplicity of meanings, appropriations, and self-fashioning devices are present in the Meissen figurines within the context of the Polish collections, and highlights this inherent incongruity and puts forward this multi-directional reading and begs for further analysis, both within the context of the Commonwealth, but also within the image of Poland and Sarmatism in Greater Europe. In the history of Meissen production, one of the earliest models of Sarmatian nobles was the Polish kiss. The model was also one of Meissen's most popular of the Polish theme and produced in many iterations by the Meissen factory. While keeping with the inherently Polish costume, the figures modeled by Johann Candler combine typical elements of Rococo aesthetic with those that are recognizably Sarmatian. The long, loose coats, the man's saber, the Konfederatka cap, which was worn by both genders, appear in different iterations of this figure. Pastel colors, floral and arabesque prints, and animal companions vary between examples, but give the typical Sarmatian preference for deep reds, browns, and dark furs, a decidedly Rococo or Western makeover. Under closer examination, the Polish kiss contains many other levels of cultural appropriation beyond the play of Sarmatism and the Western Rococo. While researching this topic, I found evidence that Candler was most likely influenced to create the Polish kiss by a copperplate print by Jean-Antoine Watteau, which is now lost, entitled La Polonaise. The closest approximation to the missing Watteau painting in copperplate might be this early 18th century chalk sketch of a young girl in Polonaise costume. Here, Watteau shows a young woman wearing the typical Konfederatka, long fur coat with her sleeves pushed up. She extends her hand upwards, possibly to receive a kiss from a bowing nobleman. The compositional and sartorial similarities between the Watteau sketch and the Polish kiss suggest the likelihood of a Watteau work as a source for the Meissen figurine. Therefore, if we accept the Watteau source for the piece, the layers of cultural appropriation and become even denser. Not only do we see a Saxon production produced for the Polish market, but it is based on a French woman imitating the Polish Sarmatian costume, which comes from Iranian dress. Even though Sarmatian identity was originally seen by the Polish nobility as a defining factor of national and class identity, and as an identifier of differentiation from their neighbors, Sarmatism appeared at once exotic and approachable to the frivolities and excesses of Europe. Even the unique nature of the visual culture produced by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was easily incorporated in Rococo fashions in the first half of the 18th century. One such example was the famous robe à la polonaise, popular in female fashion throughout the 18th century, which originated from the female costume worn by women of the Commonwealth. But to examine the fashion for all things Polish, we must once again return to Watteau. This is his 1717 La Polonaise debut. Watteau shows a young woman in a pseudo-Sarmatian costume. Her soft pink silk dress with long sleeves is lined with fur. Nevertheless, her formless headdress, tied around her head with a pink scarf, does not suggest the simplicity of the Konfederatka, but an approximation of Oriental headwear. Beyond the robe à la polonaise, the Polish costume was also appropriated more explicitly by influential women such as Maria Amalia, the daughter of Augustus III, who was painted wearing an adaptation of Sarmatian male costume in this portrait commissioned to commemorate her betrothal to Charles VII of Naples, who later became Charles III of Spain. The princess is shown wearing a feminized version of the contusz, identifiable by the metal buttons across the breast, for trim and the loose open sleeves once again thrown across her shoulder, just like in her father's portrait, which I showed you before. Adam Jasiński describes the Saxon princess's Sarmatian garments as an example of Polish courtly opulence, as well as a tool to recount a greater political narrative. It was a way, Jasiński argues, that for the Saxon court to advise their greater connection to the Polish throne to Amalia's betrothed. Her recognizably Polish costume speaks to their royal and not simply aristocratic connections, elevating her status as equal to that of Charles. Maria Amalia's Sarmatian costume, like that of Watteau's La Polonaise debut, is an appropriation of an already appropriated culture, simultaneously removed from its Iranian identity and identified closely with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth within the European imagination. The Western penchant for Polish fashion further complicates the Meissen figurines of Sarmatian nobility even further. These figurines were purchased by Polish collectors from the Meissen warehouses and even copied by local productions in cheaper faience. The Polish fashion abroad also suggests that they might have been purchased by markets outside the borders of the Commonwealth. It is not hard to imagine that the Meissen Sarmatian would have piqued the interest of collectors in Saxony and further abroad who were fascinated with the unique identity that developed in the center of the European continent. The fashion for the Meissen figurines of Polish nobles manifested itself in a moment of political uncertainty. In the last 3 decades of the century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned and occupied by Prussia, Austria, and the Russian Empire during 3 partitions in 1772, 1793, and finally 1795. The third and final partition effectively erased both Poland and Lithuania from the map of Europe until 1918. In this moment of crisis of national identity and lack of self-determination, the Meissen figurines were imbued with new meaning. With the lack of formally defined national borders, the figurines of Polish nobles existed in collections that preserved national identity and were seen as manifestations of culture that could be revived even under foreign occupation. The continued life of the Meissen Sarmatian nobles mirrored the ongoing revivals of Sarmatism even under the partition. The most prominent example of this cultural resistance through collection practices is that of Izabela Czartoryska, a Polish noblewoman, scholar, and patron of the arts, and also a collector. Her most notable contribution to the accumulated meaning of Meissen figurines of Sarmatian nobles is the establishment of the Czartoryski collection in Puławy, approximately 35 miles from Lublin, in 1793. It was the first public museum in Poland. It was free, and it was established in the midst of partition as a way to salvage Polish art and culture under foreign occupation. And the Czartoryskis were one of the greatest collectors of Meissen in the 18th century. The Meissen figurines served as an important part of the Puławy Museum and the history of the Czartoryski collection throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries. The collection is still actually part of the National Gallery. Through their material luxury and nationalist subject matter, the Meissen nobles served as a reminder of a time of courtly luxury, but also as manifestations of national difference from the Prussian, Austrian, and Russian occupying forces. The Czartoryski collection, however, could not remain in the occupied territories of Poland for too long. As Zdzisław Żegulski notes in his extensive work on the Czartoryskis, the collection, among with others, was in danger of being destroyed or looted by the occupying forces. Following the November insurrection of 1830, the collection was smuggled out of the Czartoryski estates and housed in the Hôtel Lambert in Paris. In light of the Western indifference to the Polish question throughout the 19th century, the Lambert functioned as a nexus of Polish thought, culture, and art into the early 20th century. And actually, the work was smuggled out. The collection was broken up by the Russian forces, and then they kind of stole everything back and eventually got it into Paris. It is in this potent environment of political thought and cultural ferment, that these objects in the collection of the Czartoryski acquired new and more potent meanings beyond their material splendor. So these then went back to Poland in the early 20th century, and I mean, this is common knowledge, I guess. They were then looted by the Nazis in 1939, and these are examples of Meissen porcelain figurines that are actually still missing. Even in exile, these pieces, as part of influential collections, continue to inform and strengthen national identity. Along with the Czartoryskis in the Hôtel Lambert, the collection became the backdrop for a vast community of Polish émigrés in Paris who centered on the Lambert, which functioned as the de facto government in exile, working keenly with French and British governments towards the goal of Polish independence. Through a long history of opulence and luxury, the Meissen figurines of the Polish nobles embody not only the political importance of porcelain, but also the complexity of cultural fluidity and appropriation in the forms of Turkery and early Orientalism. Within the particular context, at the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, these figurines became imbued with narratives of national identity and cultural preservation. While the politics of porcelain may be well known within art history, the acute influence of porcelain in the creation of a collective identity in splendor and in exile became a key element in the foundation of modern Polish national identity. Thank you.